Hey everybody, welcome back. We're continuing to talk about trauma, our brain, and how it kind of affects our body. So today we're going to be talking about emotions, which seems like a pretty cut and dry topic for us to talk about. But unfortunately, that's one of the things that is the most difficult for people with trauma to identify. So let's talk about kind of why people have trouble identifying their emotions. One is because people of trauma who have experienced trauma, they kind of got shamed for feeling an emotion. So we'll say you came home from school as you were young and you were super excited to show your family this A+ you got. But maybe someone in the home had a substance use disorder or a mental health disorder, or just a lot of chaos was going on. So whenever you showed them this A that you got that you were super excited about, instead of getting a yay, that's really exciting, instead you were ignored or shamed for making such an abrupt entrance into your home. Maybe they were doing their own thing in the home and they were just upset that you interrupted that. So instead of being like yay and acknowledging that, then you were shamed or hurt. So then you learn to kind of back off from those feelings, and you would say like, oh, okay, so when I feel happy, when I have that emotion in my body, and if you do it enough that you're excited to share something of happiness or pride with a family member, and that they kind of slam that down or shut that down or shame you, then you can confuse that feeling, and you can confuse that feeling with shame or fear, guilt. So when you have the emotion in your body, the physical feelings of excitement or happiness, then you can think as an adult that emotion is actually shame or guilt. So those can kind of flip the script in your brain, and you can trigger yourself anytime that you feel happy. You can actually trigger yourself into feeling shame or guilt, or the fight or flight response. Every time I get excited, I know that I've talked to a lot of people that say every time I get excited, I'm just waiting for the next shoe to drop. I'm just waiting for the next thing to happen. I'm just waiting for something bad to happen. And that's exactly accurate, because every time something good happened, maybe you were shamed or hurt or not heard. So it makes total sense. So one thing to do with your professional mental health provider is just identify those feelings in your body, and it can take a while. So each time you show up for your session, just how are you feeling today? How do you know that? What is the evidence you're feeling that way? Maybe that day when you walk in, you have butterflies in your stomach, and you're like, gosh, I'm just so hungry. I don't know. I'm just so hungry today. But maybe it's not hunger. Maybe that feeling is anxiety or hurt or grief. And grief is a feeling that we have a lot in our body that we just don't identify with. And grief isn't something that you have to grieve a person who has died. Grief is something that you can grieve an emotion, a feeling, a person, an experience. So for example, we could have grief for someone who we were in a relationship with, and we still see them. They're not dead. We still see them or know that they're still around, but we're still grieving that person. We can also grieve a person who has substance use disorder. They were in our lives for such a long time and made such an important impact to us. And while they're actively using, or even a dry user, someone who's not using but still has those behaviors that are unhealthy, we can feel grief for them. Someone with Alzheimer's, we can grieve that relationship as well, because they're just a different person. So there's a lot of different kinds of grief we can feel in our body. So for example, you may be walking into a room and you feel a total darkness and sadness, and you identify that as anxiety, for example. And then if you sit down with your provider and kind of process through that and think through that, it may not be anxiety at all. It may be that this is a place that you remember from your childhood, and you miss your father who hasn't been around for many, many years. So we need to identify these feelings so we can learn ways to cope with them. So let's say that you are feeling anxious and you identify as hunger. then you may go get something to eat, and that may satisfy that dopamine, and so you're like, oh, okay, got it. That was hunger. I ate. I have a dopamine rush that you get anytime that you eat. But then you don't really feel satisfied. And that's because that feeling you were having was not hunger. That feeling you were having was anxiety or grief or guilt or shame. And you just didn't identify it correctly. So instead, you could say, oh my gosh, okay, this feeling in my body is actually grief. Now let me think about how this setting or how this person is triggering my grief response, and what might I be grieving right now. And grief doesn't necessarily mean that you're crying and, in experiencing the sadness and the depression of grief, but you can feel it in your body. So understanding how your body is feeling is the key to knowing how you can cope with those things. So kind of think of it as like you have a feeling in your body, and then that feeling triggers or gives you an understanding of that emotion. And that emotion, if it is correct and you identify it correctly, then you can start to cope with it and process it healthfully. So that is kind of why us therapists are always like, well, what are you feeling? What are you feeling? How does that make you feel? How do you know that? Because we want to be sure that we're treating the correct feeling and not just the sensation that you're having in your body, and you're identifying it incorrectly. So if you have any questions about that, please ask, comment below, or talk to your mental health care provider, and we will see you guys next week. Thanks.